This is called oogenesis. And it can be divided into two parts. Firstly, prenatal, that is before birth, changes and stages. Second is the postnatal, that is after birth, stages and changes. The female embryo. Now, does it have an ovary? Even when unborn? Yes, it does. Oogonia multiply and form further many oogonia, of course, by multiplication division called mitosis. They are 2n in nature, that is diploid, and they form millions of oogonia. Oogonia, another name for them is egg mother cells or germ cells. These are the ones which I have shown you here, and they finally give rise to primary oocytes. Again, 2n in number, that is diploid in nature. These orange ones which I have shown, mitosis is called equational division because the 2n cells give rise finally to 2n only, isn't it? Whereas in meiosis, the 2n, that is diploid cells, get reduced to one set of chromosomes, and there are two meiosis, meiosis first and meiosis second, birth of the girl child. Now the primary oocytes, remember this orange ones which I have made, which are 2n in nature, which were found in the ovary of fetus, female fetus, they are again transferred to the female baby. Can you see the ovaries here? It also has ovaries, and in the ovaries you will find primary oocytes lying. And once they are formed from the fetus. Whatever number are passed, they are passed. No further production ever occurs in the born child of these primary oocytes. Primary oocytes will be carried on further, 2n in nature, in the child also. And this is the childhood ovary transfer section which I have drawn here to show the millions of primary oocytes, 2n in number. From the girl child, the primary oocytes, that is 2n in nature, diploid cells found in the ovary, they reach the adolescent girl's ovaries. That means the girl, when changes into adolescent, that is teenager, or during puberty period, that is starting from around 12 years of age in girls, then look at these ovaries I have drawn here. What will you find here? The primary oocyte lying. That means in all these, the female baby born, then the childhood of the girl, and then the puberty stage of the girl, you will find primary oocyte only lying and lying. But it will keep on maturing, and it will form firstly a primary follicle, then a secondary follicle, and finally a tertiary follicle, which you can see here. Now look at the primary follicle and its structure. This orange one is the primary oocyte, 2n cell, isn't it? And around it there have been many layers, many of cells lying, and these are called the granulosa cells. Granulosa cells, shown in purple. After this, it changes into the secondary follicle. It matures further during puberty, you can say, and a theca or wall can be seen, as you can see outside. New development, and many layers of these granulosa cells can be seen. These purple cells can be seen, and finally inside the primary oocyte, that is orange colored, is lying. Now coming to the tertiary follicle, further maturation of the primary oocyte occurs. This orange one is the primary oocyte which I have shown, and there is a fluid filled cavity which has been shown called antrum, fluid filled cavity. And then there are theca externa wall and theca interna, two layers. So during puberty period, the primary follicle, secondary follicle, and finally tertiary follicle were formed ultimately, and all these contain, can you see these orange colored cell inside this? This is the 2N primary oocyte lying over here in the follicles, isn't it? Now, the this tertiary follicle, which I have drawn here, I have made a bigger one here to show you, containing the primary oocyte, that is 2N cell inside it, this orange, having a fluid-filled cavity called antrum. It changes further and matures further into Graafian follicle. That is a mature follicle. Fully mature follicle is called Graafian follicle. And it contains the primary oocyte, that is 2N, and there is zona pellucida, layer around it, around the primary oocyte to be seen. Then there is a neck-like area also, which you can see here. That is a pedicel kind of stalk kind of a structure is also there, over which the primary oocyte lies. Now, in some books you may see secondary oocyte written over here instead of the primary. So don't get confused. Actually what happens is that primary oocyte has to finally give rise to the secondary oocyte, and it is a merging of stages. So you may find the secondary oocyte interchangeably be lying as in the tertiary follicle or in the secondary follicle. It could happen. So primary oocyte, that is 2N cell, gives rise to secondary oocyte, which is 1N, that is haploid cell, through meiosis first. And finally the meiosis first gets over. It had been right from the fetus up to the puberty. It had been arrested. That is only prophase first. Till then it had been there. Meiosis first was not over. But now, just before ovulation was to occur in the this girl, just before ovulation, that is release of egg by the body, by the ovary, what happens? Secondary oocytes are formed. So just before ovulation, during puberty time, in the girl child, what happens? The primary oocyte, 2N in nature, gets converted into secondary oocyte. The nature is diploid, haploid here. This is a haploid. This was diploid. So it is a reductional division which has occurred here, and that is meiosis first, which has got completed here. And this occurs just before ovulation. Secondary oocyte is formed within the tertiary follicle, you can say. Now, by completing meiosis first, secondary oocytes are formed. Secondary oocyte here has been shown to be released by the ovary. This is the ovary of this girl, isn't it? Transverse section. And here this Graafian follicle, the finally fully mature follicle containing the secondary oocyte, ruptures, and what is thrown out? The secondary oocyte 1N cell, haploid cell, is thrown out or released. That means, very strange thing, that it is not the ovum which is released by the ovary, mature ovum, during ovulation. It is the secondary oocyte which is released in humans, in the human girl, and not the ovum. This pink colored is the secondary oocyte which has been released, okay, and it keeps on traveling along the oviduct, that is the fallopian tube, and in the fallopian tube it may get fertilized. It may get fertilized, this secondary oocyte, by a sperm, that is 1N, that is male gamete. It may fertilize this. Look at it, this sperm which I have shown. Finally ovum will be produced. This will trigger the formation of the ovum, and a second polar body will be produced. This is called meiosis second. Meiosis second will take place now due to the triggering by fertilization. This has triggered the meiosis second. Ovum will be formed from the secondary oocyte, and a second polar body, a small body. Ovum is big, and the second unequal division leads to a smaller body, a smaller cell produced, and this is called polar body. And finally the ovum will produce the zygote because it has been fertilized. And what if fertilization does not take place? Then what will happen? Will the ovum be formed? No, the ovum will at this time not be formed. There will be no meiosis second occurring if there is no fertilization. And what will happen? This cell, that is the secondary oocyte, will be damaged, it will be destroyed along with the periods. Firstly, we'll talk of the female embryo. Starting from here, primary oocytes are formed from the oogonia. Primary oocytes are 2n in nature. Oogonia were also 2n. It was simply mitosis occurring. The baby is born, female baby is born with what? With the primary oocyte in the ovary. And the primary oocyte is carried further to her childhood and up to the puberty. And in the puberty, just before ovulation is to occur, the arrested meiosis finally gets over and secondary oocyte, that is 1n cell, is produced plus the first polar body. Now look at the unequal division. 2 cells were to form, daughter cells, but one is quite big called secondary oocyte and one is very small. The polar body is very small and finally degenerates. So what happens is that the secondary oocyte will be thrown out during ovulation. And so what happens? This secondary oocyte will be entering into the fallopian tube due to ovulation, right? And it may meet a sperm, it may not meet a sperm. If it happens to meet a sperm, that is called fertilization. If it occurs, then meiosis second will take place. Then only meiosis second takes place to form an actual ovum. Ovum is produced plus polar body, a small polar body is again produced, which gets degenerated